Steve McMahon, he did a good job telling stories in 2008 and then seems to have lost the mojo on some substantive matters. Let's go through a couple of them. Health care. Where was the mistake in communication relative to health care?
Well, I think the Republicans got out there and framed it pretty effectively, pretty quickly, and what the administration didn't do quite as well is explain to the American people all the benefits of health care reform. And frankly, one of the other things that they probably should have done is explained how health care reform is actually partly about health care reform, but it's also partly getting America on a better track financially and economically, because health care costs were dragging down our economy, and our economy can't be strong and successful in the future if that were to continue. So one of the things that I think they didn't do enough of is connecting the dots, but they're starting to connect the dots now. They did a lot of telling people what they did. They didn't do quite as much telling people why they did it and why it was important and why it mattered to everyone. And I think that's a lesson.
Ron Reagan,
that,
would you put the auto bailout on this list of substantive matters where the president could be taking some credit and selling better?
Yes, absolutely. He needs to talk about it. Would we rather not have a GM or Chrysler here in the United States? Would we rather those jobs just didn't exist anymore? Yes, he needs to blow his horn about this, but he also needs to not just talk about his story and where he wants to take the country and the good things that he has managed to do. He also needs to tell the opposition's story. The Republican Party now has thoroughly jumped the shark. They are ripe for ridicule and satire. Barack Obama ought to hire some guys from the Harvard Lampoon, stick them down in the basement of the White House, and have them doing nothing but writing jokes about Republicans and Mitt Romney, because you couldn't make this stuff up.
Steve McMahon, the president doesn't get credit for a tax cut that he was responsible for. I think another great example, I mentioned it here on Hardball a couple of nights ago, of where he's just not sold it.
Well, he hasn't sold it. The Republicans are blocking it, and they don't seem to be paying a price at all. You're absolutely right. The economic things that he's done, to some degree, people are aware of, but they don't always have a positive impression of those things because he hasn't been as effective as he'd like to be in telling the story about why those things matter. In Detroit, for instance, you know, they've got GM today, and they've got an auto industry, and it's important for America to make things. People understand that. It's important for manufacturing jobs to be in this country, not just in China and India. People understand that. But connecting those dots is something that politicians, not just Barack Obama, but many politicians have trouble doing. They're very good at saying what they did. They're very bad at sometimes articulating why it matters to folks and why folks should care about it and appreciate it more.
President Obama acknowledged his oratory prowess during the 2008 campaign and how things have changed since then. Watch.
When I ran, everybody said, well, he can give a great speech, but can he actually, manage the job? And then in my first 2 years, I think the notion was, well, he's been juggling and managing a lot of stuff, but, where's the story that tells us where he's going? And I think that was a legitimate criticism.
Ron Reagan, is part of the problem for the president that it's easier to control the message when you're the candidate? Everyone looks to you, but now when you're in office, you have portfolio. With portfolio come lots of surrogates, now both in the White House and outside the White House, and it's hard to manage the message.
To some extent, that is correct, but you've got the bully pulpit also. The president doesn't seem to have understood from the get-go that you have to be a salesman, too. Telling the story, as he seems to indicate in this interview, is part of the job. I mean, it isn't just being a technocrat and, as he said, getting the policy right. I mean, you can kind of hire people to do that. But you're the leader. You need to lead. You need to tell the story. You need to inspire. And I think he gets that now, and I hope we see more of it during the campaign.
What could he have learned from your father in this regard, on getting his message out, telling his story? Your father was so effective in this regard.
You have to be the salesman, and you have to keep being the salesman. Take the health care bill. You have to pre-sell it. You have to say, this is what we're going to do and this is why. Then you have to sell it while it's happening. Okay, this is what we're doing and why. But after the legislation passes, you can't stop. You have to continue telling people this is why it was a good idea, because the other side is going to be trying to undo it the whole time. So he hasn't been as aggressive as he needs to be in that regard.
Hey, Steve McMahon, a quick final question, if I might. Is there a political downside to the president acknowledging to Charlie Rose that he's been ineffective in this regard? You heard the response from Mitt Romney.
I actually don't think there is a political downside. There may be a political upside. One of the things you see with the president right now is his personal approval rating, the way people feel about him as a person. is much higher, frankly, than his job approval rating. And one of the reasons is because of what you just saw. He's not somebody like our previous president who's unwilling to admit a mistake or ever reconsider a position. He's somebody who's thoughtful, and he's somebody who thinks about these things and learns from them, and hopefully tries to improve and be a better person and a better president tomorrow than he was yesterday. I think that's a sign of maturity, and it's one of the reasons that people really, really want Barack Obama to succeed. And even those people who disagree with many of his policies believe that.